This is the fourth PowerPoint for week 1, Ancient Egypt. In the ancient world, Egypt was quite isolated, with deserts on both sides. The Egyptian civilization really followed closely the Nile River. And it was the Nile River's periodic flooding that made civilized life possible in Egypt. During drought or famine, Egypt was the place to go because Egypt always had water. Compare the story of Joseph and his brothers in Genesis. I have been told personally that the contrast between Egypt as livable and then everything else is quite dramatic, that one can literally stand with one foot on fertile, moist ground and the other foot desert, and desert that goes on seemingly forever as the Sahara. Now the kingdom of Egypt was divided into two parts, Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. But please note, Upper Egypt is actually to the south and Lower Egypt is to the north. This is because the Nile River actually flows north. It begins in the south, far to the south, in the continent of Africa, and flows north. And unlike Mesopotamia, Egypt had a lot of stone to work with. In Mesopotamia, the primary building material was mud brick. We call it adobe here. In Egypt, especially for their monuments, stone was the material of choice. This slide looks at possible connections between the emergence of Mesopotamian culture and the sudden emergence of Egyptian culture. It is debated between Egyptologists on the one hand and Assyriologists, Mesopotamian scholars on the other hand. I give it to you here for your interest. Now, Egypt seems to go from the Neolithic to a complex civilization overnight. There is no apparent linear development that can be traced. Now, the king, at times called Pharaoh, is somehow responsible in the mind of the Egyptians for the yearly success of the Nile. The Nile floods every year and helps things to grow that way. The king's throne was Isis, the wife of Osiris, and the mother of Horus. So in other words, the king sat on a divine throne. The king, in fact, was identified with Isis's son, Horus. The king in Egypt, when Egypt first appears in the record and we can understand what's going on, the king is divine. Mesopotamia, that seemed to be a gradual process where over time the king or the ruler became identified as being somehow divine, but in Egypt it's always been that way in the ancient world. And another aspect of Egypt is that Egypt seeks to portray changeless continuity over thousands of years. This is somewhat true, but not entirely accurate. There were times, and we'll look at a couple, when, for instance, when the Hyksos rulers came in, foreign rulers, the Egyptians downplay those kind of events or occurrences and seek, rather, in their art and culture to show continuity of time, or continuity of the culture. Here's a map of ancient Egypt. You'll see the Nile flows upward, and at the top in Lower Egypt is the area of the pyramids and the important city of Memphis and modern-day Cairo. Way up the river, heading south, you run into Abydos. And Abydos is an important burial center. And then further south is Luxor, or Thebes, which is very important historically for Egypt as well. And that's a pretty great distance between Thebes in the south and Memphis in the north. Thebes is the center often of power in Upper Egypt, and Memphis is the power in Lower Egypt. You'll also notice south of Memphis a ways is El Amarna. That will become an important city later on. Egyptian history begins with King Narmer. It is Narmer who united Upper and Lower Egypt, and the Egyptians have always seen the beginnings of their kingdom from this point forward. He is likely the same person known as Menes. This is the beginning of the first dynasty of Egypt. It is said that he established his capital at the new city of Memphis, and it occurred when he diverted the waters of the Nile. The royal burial grounds of Saqqara and Giza are located nearby. And the uniting of Egypt under Narmer is commemorated on the palette of King Narmer, which is on the next slide, and is also shown in your book, Figure 2.3. This is the beginning of Egypt's Bronze Age and the beginning of Egyptian writing. Here is the palette of Narmer, and I want to note at the bottom the Egyptian relief style in art, especially the points that the head is in profile but the eye is front facing, the shoulders face forward, and the legs and feet are in profile, 1 foot forward. This is the way human figures appear in the pyramids and other places where you find two-dimensional art. Egyptian religion was polytheistic, that is, many gods were involved. And like Mesopotamia, various gods were associated with certain cities. Egypt has no eschatology. Things just go on. The world in the Egyptian mind will never end. It is a theocratic state, that it is ruled by a god. The king is a god. As I noted before, he was identified with Horus, the son of Isis, and the son of Osiris. After death, the king, the dead king, becomes Osiris. Osiris is associated with the dead. Osiris is in fact the Lord of the dead, sometimes referred to as the Lord of the West, because the dead dwell to the west. We'll look at that again. Later on, the king was linked with Amun-Re. Amun-Re is the sun god. Though Egypt didn't have an idea of a resurrection of the dead, there was to be some kind of blessed afterlife, especially for those who pass the judgment. The Ka is the presence of the departed at the tomb. And early on we see this belief centered around the king, but as time goes on, it seems to take on a democratizing aspect. More and more people are included within the idea of this afterlife. Mummification was important to the Egyptians because somehow it involved preserving the ka. And thus, the deceased would be offered food and beverage somewhere near the tomb. Now here's the Osiris myth. Osiris is known as the Lord of the West, the underworld. Information about the afterlife is found in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, a very famous work. It's called the Book of the Dead because the text was found in funerary sites. Scholars over time have noted some slight similarities between perhaps the cult of Isis and the Virgin Mary's cult. I leave that up to you to consider. And the last point shows that private people, that is, people outside of the royal sphere, were taking on certain aspects of enjoying the afterlife. Here's a timeline for ancient Egypt. You have the early dynastic period beginning in about 3100 BC. This is the beginning of the Egyptian Bronze Age as well, and Egyptian writing. Then you have a period, extended period, called the Old Kingdom. That is when the pyramids occur. So the pyramids are fairly early in Egyptian history and only appear for the most part, if not entirely, in that early period. Then there's an intermediate period. This is where things get kind of politically confusing and perhaps a crisis. And then the Middle Kingdom, wherein the center of power was down in Thebes in southern Egypt or Upper Egypt. Then the very famous second intermediate period, where the Hyksos, Semitic rulers, rose to power. And then finally the New Kingdom. And this is the one famous in the movie The Ten Commandments, where you have the powerful chariot-borne Pharaoh and the famous burials in the Valley of the Kings, most famous of all, King Tut. This slide notes that the first two dynasties are buried at Abydos, which is the seat of Osiris, and we've already noted the connection between Osiris and the dead. Memphis, to the north, near the pyramids, is ideologically the city of kingship and is situated on the west bank of the Nile from nearby Heliopolis. Heliopolis is Greek for city of the sun. Egypt's year was 365 days long. Now here is an early funerary memorial from the first dynasty called a mastaba, kind of a flat, stepped memorial. Beginning with the third dynasty is the Old Kingdom. And it is thought that these mastaba, the true rise of pharaonic Egypt, part of the conceptual capital is at Memphis for later pyramids, and stayed that way through the rest of the Old Kingdom. A famous king is King Djoser, who built the step pyramid of Saqqara, and we'll look at that shortly, that was said to have been designed by Imhotep, his chief minister, and who was very famous for his learning. The earliest pyramid is that of King Djoser, and it's called the Step Pyramid of Djoser or the Step Pyramid of Saqqara. Perhaps it's designed by stacking mastaba one on top of the other. That's one idea of what's going on here. You have the dimensions given on the slide. And note that it is built on the west bank of the Nile. All the major funerary structures in Egypt are on the west side of the Nile. The west is the direction of the dead. And it's not only that way for Egypt, it is that way for the Greeks later on, for Mesopotamia. When Gilgamesh goes to the underworld, he goes the direction of the west. The west is the direction that the sun sets, and then the sun rises every morning in the east, and thus the east is the direction of newness, of resurrection, those concepts. Zoser belonged to the third dynasty. When the fourth dynasty begins, we are in the period of the true pyramids. They are an old kingdom phenomenon. And the first is the pyramid of Seneferu at Dashur. Not far from Saqqara. You can see the little map all on the west side of the Nile. And all of these various areas, Giza, Saqqara, Dashur, are known as the Memphite necropolis. Memphis being the capital city, necropolis, though, being the city of the dead. So they're in the area of Memphis, but they are called collectively, these sites, the Memphite necropolis. You can see that this first pyramid sometimes is referred to as the bent pyramid. The sides do not stay true, but it bends in. At Giza, part of the Memphite necropolis, are the three major pyramids of related kings, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. And next to their names are the Greek names, Cheops, Khephren, and Mycerinus. The one in the middle is Khafre's. The distant one belongs to Cheops, and the nearest one is Menkaure's. The one in the middle looks the largest, but it actually is not the largest. It's the distant one. The distant one, belonging to Khufu or Cheops, is called the Great Pyramid of Giza. Now, the pyramids look kind of rough. Here you can see the great stones making up in the foreground, I believe, is the Great Pyramid. And then you see behind it Khepren's pyramid. Note that Khepren's pyramid has the casing stone still intact at the top. All three of these pyramids would have been covered with these smooth casing stones, and they would have had themselves, the pyramids, a smooth appearance. And buried deep beneath the sand, they have actually found a few of the casing stones for the Great Pyramid. Why are they not there now? As so often happens throughout history, great monuments are kind of used as a quarry for other later building projects. So some of the stones of the Great Pyramid, the casing stones, are to be found in later structures. The Giza pyramid, known as the Great Pyramid, really is a one-of-a-kind. Unlike any other pyramid, the Great Pyramid has this network of interior passageways that have become, of course, the subject of speculation, but doubtless it is an incredible the Mesopotamian ziggurat memorial with the Egyptian pyramid. Go to the next slide, you'll see the Great Pyramids similar network, but they are also very different. Passageways. The ziggurat is made of brick. What the other pyramids have of note, and the temples to a living deity hardly even enter into the breaks down over time itself because it's made of mud brick. So
Thus, it is
the building
symbolic
of the
Mesopotamia's
great pyramids
kingdoms.
that much
Here today
more difficult.
and gone tomorrow.
If you go to the next
The
slide,
Egyptian
you will
pyramid,
see
on the other hand, is
the
built of
incredible
stone.
grand
It
gallery
is a tomb for a dead pharaoh,
inside of the Great Pyramid,
and it is built
This is not
for
under the
forever.
ground. This is actually
Thus, it
part
is symbolic
of the building.
of Egypt's value of
And on
changeless
the next slide, what
continuity.
they found, the Sphinx, some have thought is a colossal sculpture that guards the dead. The Sphinx is actually part of the Giza complex and is attached by a walkway to Khephr's pyramid. This slide gives some important information about the Sphinx. I note that the word Sphinx may be from Shesep Ankh, living image. Perhaps that's where the name derives. Ankh, by the way, is that Egyptian symbol. Looks like a Christian cross, except the top of it is an oval shape. It is clearly, it's well known to be the Egyptian symbol for life. In the vicinity of Khephr's pyramid are some structures that one could classify really as megalithic, and you'll note that they use the post and lintel construction method. We saw it first when we were discussing Stonehenge and Neolithic memorials. Now, in sculpture in the round, the Egyptians had a canon or standard for how art ought to be formed that way. And note here, the left leg is forward, the fists are clenched, and the face, the countenance, is not reflecting emotion. This is the standard way the Egyptians represented sculpture in the round. And this is significant because when we see early Greek sculpture, it's going to be following the Egyptian canon. Very interesting. Here is the interior of the tomb of Pepi II, and I want to note the ceiling. Notice that in this funerary monument, when the Old Kingdom ended, is of the heavens, first intermediate period began, and then when it ended, a similar motif the middle later on of Egypt when began. We get to ancient Christianity, and you can note the dates there. Go to the next slide. There is not a lot of see these monumental architectural work to show, because along so much of it was used later to build other things, so it's gone. But I don't know some of the texts or a wall were left behind, certainly similar to what we saw in the Neolithic period. Kingdom is actually known as the high point. So these are interesting connections. Literature. Are they real connections? When the Middle Kingdom came to an end, then began the Second Intermediate Period, and this is of interest to Bible scholars. The Hyksos were eventually expelled. The Second Intermediate Period with a group known as the Hyksos. If you go to the next slide, you'll see thereafter emerges the New Kingdom. This is the high point. They were foreign rulers of Egypt. Egypt really begins to move out beyond, and this seems to be isolated borders. Similar to the story, we have here the emphasis in our Joseph, the younger king, who is a warrior, and represented eventually punishing Egypt's enemies, overthrown. Egypt carries on great correspondence with other the children of Israel powers around the Near East. Are these two stories connected? And some of these are preserved to be some connection, but great controversy over how much of a connection to note the last point, that some of the great temples it is a significant period date to this period in Egyptian history, whether it's strongly related to the Bible or not. And it was, as you can see on the Hyksos slide, the Hyksos who introduced in New Kingdom architecture. Outstanding is the Valley of the Kings near Thebes, with elaborate rock-cut royal tombs on the west bank of the Nile. This is where King Tut's tomb was found. Also important, associated with the burials, were funerary temples. Important find is the temple of Hatshepsut, Queen, near Luxor, still being built with post and lintel construction. Interestingly, in that area to the south, in the area of Thebes, Luxor, and Karnak, there are no pyramids, regardless of what Las Vegas has named the Luxor and given it the shape of a pyramid. The city of Luxor and the pyramid, in actuality, do not belong together. I want to quickly go through a few of the New Kingdom rulers. You will not be tested on all of these. Anything you will be tested on, I will let you know in the review sheet that I hand out a week before any exam. Tutmosis the First is important. He's early on. He moved the capital from Thebes in the south to Memphis. Recall, Memphis is the ideal city of kingship to the north. So this is a move to consolidate power. And he was eventually buried across the Nile from Thebes at the Valley of the Kings. He was the first to be buried there. And Tutmosis II married his half-sister Hatshepsut, and she is very important to us. So the next slide gives information about Hatshepsut. This slide looks at the reign of Queen Hatshepsut. She is unique because it was rare for a woman to rule over Egypt, and she had a very significant reign. Among the important rulers on this slide is Amenophis III. And notice the god's name Amen there in the first part of the name. He enjoyed a very long reign, almost 40 years, and this was a time of peace and prosperity for Egypt. He had a famous wife, Queen T. Perhaps she was from Nubia, far to the south. And he was the father of one of Egypt's most famous rulers. On the next slide, you'll encounter Akhenaten. Now we encounter the Amarna Revolution in the New Kingdom. It was a revolution in three ways. It was a political revolution, an artistic revolution, and a religious revolution. And it's centered around the ruler Amenophis IV, who changed his name to Akhenaten. Now in the late New Kingdom, you can see the religious revolution already in one pharaoh who's especially famous. Gets rid of his name, the second god, who reigned for 67 years, and takes on the name warrior and a builder. That is the name of the sun disk. And his wife is the famous Nefertiti, the pharaoh Tut may have been his brother in the Bible. As part of his political revolution, he moved the capital to El Amarna. After he ruled a place that really hadn't been significant is a discovery in archaeology. A new city in Egypt called the Merneptah, which mentions a new style of art emerges, and I note a number of images in your text. The Rosetta Stone is what unlocked the Egyptian language for modern scholars, because it is written in three languages: Greek, Demotic, and Egyptian hieroglyphic. And it's the Greek that is important because modern scholars know Greek, and they were able to begin deciphering Egyptian because it's the same thing in Greek and hieroglyphic here, and in Demotic. It was discovered by one of Napoleon's men, and I should probably add that Napoleon's men are also the reason why the face of the Sphinx is distorted. They were using it for target practice. Anyway, here's the Rosetta Stone, the key that Jean Champollion used to decipher ancient Egyptian. Any discussion of ancient Egypt should also mention ancient Nubia, or Kush as it is sometimes called, further south up the Nile from Egypt, because there was interaction between Egypt and Nubia. I've already mentioned Queen T. Here, the god emphasized was the god Ammon, which we saw also worshipped greatly in Egypt. And at a later date, Nubia even ruled over the area of Egypt. More and more is now coming out about ancient Nubia. More is being discovered. So it's important to watch the developments going on with Nubia, Kush. In your book is pictured King Shaboko's bronze statue. And note it involves the god Ammon and the ram's horns. Now, why are the ram's horns so important? Well, they represent the god Ammon. And much, much later, we'll mention this later, when Alexander the Great goes to Egypt, he is declared the son of Zeus Ammon by the priest of Ammon. And Alexander will be recognized to this day on his coins wearing the ram's horns.